Welcome to How the Constitution Works and Why It Doesn't. I am William Cooper, and with me is my co host, Edward Larson. Ed, how are you?
Doing great. Glad to be talking to you again.
Absolutely. And this is our first episode of our new podcast. We're very excited about it. Lots to talk about. You can tell by the title, plenty of material. And we want to kick things off with a little bit of background about ourselves. So, Ed, why don't you tell listeners about your background?
Thanks, Will. Yeah, this came out of because we did one of your other podcasts together. And it sort of churned out of that and your book, How America Works and Why It Doesn't. And thinking more, we were talking about more about the Constitution because you were picking me because I'm a historian. I'm a lawyer, just like you. But I also teach law and I am a uh, constitutional law and other sorts of law, but I'm a legal historian. I have a lot of books about legal history from all periods. I have books, several books that cover the Constitution, the drafting, modern libraries, edited edition of the Madison's Notes to the Constitution. I'm the co-editor of that volume. Worked on several books that talk about both the Constitution and the ratification. So I know the original stuff. I have amendments and articles about the different ones of the amendments, like the 12th Amendment, the 22nd Amendment, different amendments. And then I have books on more modern legal history. I've done a lot of work on the progressive era. So I've covered these different eras. And I certainly agreed with the sentiments you expressed, stemming from your wonderful book, How America Works and Why It Doesn't, as applied to the Constitution, what we were talking about. There are lots of wonderful things in the Constitution. And I sometimes fear that people don't understand those wonderful things. But there are a lot of things in the Constitution that just don't work today. Maybe can solve by the amendment process. So I can sort of look back to see what's in the Constitution and why was it there? Why do we have the requirement that the state shall decide how elections for the Senate and House are run, but Congress will make restrictions to that? In contrast, why does it say that the states only will decide how electors are chosen to choose the president? I can look back to why those are in there, and then we can talk about, are they outdated? Do they still work? Were they were and for some of them were they brilliant? And they anticipated future developments. The Constitution's a weird document, pluses and minuses, good things and bad things. And I think if we can help people talk about how it was. So I'd sort of look back, but I'm thinking about you. Can't you look forward?
Yeah, and that's where I can come in, and certainly we both can look forward and backwards, but my emphasis as a political analyst and columnist can be looking forward. And I think taking those two together, right? Ed's deep history and understanding, and he was modest in his background. He's a truly a leading scholar in this area and a Pulitzer Prize winning author. So the expertise is very deep. And then I can take my focus on current events and how things are going to play out in the future. And when you root that analysis of what comes next in a deep background and deep understanding, I think the insights will be really helpful for understanding where we're headed. I
It's not
also,
just us two, if I can add. I don't mean to interrupt. I want to hear
please.
everything else you're saying. But we both have a lot of contacts and we can bring in guests because there are a bunch of topics, and I think we can sort of suggest some of those today. A bunch of topics where this comes out. And if we can bring in, thanks to your contacts and my contacts, your contacts in current law, mine in both current law, but in history as well, historians, we can bring in the right guest for each of these issues, such as the war powers or gun rights or reproductive rights. Bring in the right third person or fourth person, even if we wanted to deepen that discussion of how the Constitution works and why it doesn't.
Absolutely. And there's lots of people that are really focused in on specific issues. They're scholars, leading scholars, say, in the war power or in tariffs or the amendment process. So we have an incredible roster of potential guests that we can do deep dives into. And then the show as a whole can look at that entire subject, how the Constitution works and why it doesn't, taken in its totality. I think it might be nice now to turn to an example to illustrate what we're talking about. And something that's very much in the news every day is President Trump's approach with tariffs.
Oh.
So why don't we start, if you don't mind, give us the background here. How does the Constitution actually work when it comes to tariffs? And what's that background?
It's a great question because it is very much in the news today, and it's shocking how President Trump is using tariff powers in a way that no president really ever has. Some of the others you can think of precedent, but when you think about it, remember, even when you were in grade school, you learned a very simplistic version of why we had the American Revolution. That's 100, 250 years ago. It was no taxation without representation. Now, the whole basis of that was
Yes.
that Parliament and the King were putting taxes on the American colonies, and the colonies didn't have any say in it. Now, that just doesn't begin then. You can go back to the earliest, you can go back to medieval England, medieval France. The one right, whether it's in the Magna Carta or equivalent documents in France, the one right that some sort of a parliament collection of nobles or somebody else, because back then the only people paying taxes were nobles, that a legislature had to do it, a representative body, and that ended up, it ended up to the fall of the Stuart monarchy because finally Charles the First couldn't keep his wars going without calling Parliament, and they cut off his head. And same way with Louis the 16th, he needed that money. He had to go to Parliament, and they ended up cutting off his head. So the idea that so rooted in our history that at least a representative body gets to decide if they're actually so the Constitution puts right in because it's so in many ways, the things that are in the Constitution, like no search and seizure, come out of problems that led to the revolution. We can talk about search and seizure because that was the Otis's big concern. The general writs that led into the Constitution. Well, nothing more so than the people's representative get to decide if they're taxed. So the Constitution says gives the exclusive power to tax, including tariffs, by word, that word tariffs, because the tariffs were one of the issues in the Revolutionary War. It was those were the when you had the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, that was the Sugar Act that they were fighting this revolution for. So the tariffs can only be decided by Congress, and so you see Congress very engaged. Trump looks back to Hoover and the McKinley and the Texas tariffs they put in. Well, they got Congress to approve them. So the issue of what the Constitution says about tariffs, and in other words, how the Constitution works, and then why it doesn't. So there would be a great example. There are others of that category. It's in the Constitution, but it's ignored or attempts to be ignored. Other examples that fit that category, I think, would be war powers. Suddenly we've got presidents doing wars. The Constitution says Congress shall declare war. Another thing is controlling elections. President Trump is talking about nationalizing elections. Well, the Constitution is really clear that the power to control elections is with the states. And that's from an era of states' rights. So these are things we can discuss between ourselves and maybe with leading experts on those questions.
Absolutely. And I wish it was more a part of the debate to hear what you just said about tariffs. What a great example. It's right there in the Constitution, even says the word tariffs. So, so much of the debate, I think, in our discourse is, well, what should it be or what makes more sense? But sometimes you just need to open up the document and look at it And it's a crystal clear example here of how the Constitution is supposed to work and how it's not working. And another observation I have about contemporary working of government, particularly in the Trump administration, is you see, as you've given several examples, how the administration will do something, it's contrary to the plain language, the unambiguous meaning of the Constitution. But because of how the system works, like we've seen with tariffs, when Trump issues the executive order, it goes into effect. You have to actually litigate and get a court to rule against him, which can take years at times. So the Constitution is not working during that interim period before the courts, as we're seeing with tariffs. Did the founders think about that at all, and how you could have these long periods of litigation where totally contrary to the Constitution, how things are operating? What might they, if they didn't think about it, what might they think about it if they saw how this is playing out?
Well, they realized that was a problem, an issue. Um, and that's why, if you look back to the founders, they all talked about this Constitution will only work if with virtuous leaders. And that's what I think they meant with virtuous leaders. Washington said it, Adams said it. Adams, President Adams, said it so clearly while he was president. He says, this Constitution, for controlling, if a person is out of control, it's like weaving nets or making nets to catch whales. Now, he was a New Englander, and his point was, yeah, you weave nets to catch fish, to cod, but you don't catch a whale. A whale will sail right through this net. And he says, the Constitution will only work. It's designed, our government is designed for a moral or religious people. And that's Ben Franklin made that similar reference when he was at the last day of the Constitutional Convention. He said, you know, this thing's got its problems and could easily lead to tyranny. But as long as we have somebody with virtue, and I think the first leader will have virtue, he was referring to Washington, who he knew well, they were close friends, it'll work. The question is, well, what will play on? And that's why when he walked out of that meeting where he gave that famous speech, the leading socialite of Philadelphia, Elizabeth Powell, who had all the parties every night, came up to him and asked him, well, and famously, well, what have you crafted for us, Dr. Franklin? And he said, a republic if you can keep it. And so
The
all of
famous line.
Monroe, Madison, they all raised the points that says, we've got to assume that we drafted, the Constitution provides the rules of the game. But, you know, if you're playing pickleball, if you're playing tennis, you know, only if the people playing respect those rules. If they don't, the game doesn't work. And so the players have to respect it. It's not just, they knew it just didn't rely on the court's respect imposing it. Because as Andrew Jackson famously, supposedly said, when he didn't like the Supreme Court's ruling, he says, well, Mr. Marshall, that was the Chief Justice, Mr. Marshall's made his ruling. Now let him enforce it. Not only does it take 2 years, as you say, or 3 years maybe for the court to give a ruling, as with the tariff issue, it keeps getting kicked down the court. Even then, will the president follow it? That's a constant question. And that's why the virtuous leaders, but they set the frameworks. It's up to the courts and the people and the voters and Congress to hold everybody, not just the president, but also the senators and representatives and the so-called deep state, hold them to the rules of the game.
Yep. It's a republic if we can keep it. That famous line that always stays relevant, perhaps more so now than it's been in quite some time. Related area that really has my attention looking forward is court orders. So far, the Trump administration, I think, has largely followed them. I've personally been relieved by that because to me, that's a huge bright line in terms of the state of our country and the type of government that we have. And at any moment, it feels like that could change. It's really hard to tell. But if Trump if we don't have the courts as a bulwark against the executive, uh, then that ultimate restraint that I think the most important restraint, because there's limits on what Congress can do, especially when you've got, it takes 2/3 of the Senate to remove from office after impeachment and so on. But if Trump starts ignoring court orders, I think things could really accelerate in the wrong direction. What are the origins of judicial review? You touched on it a little bit, but maybe you could tell us more. What were the founders thinking? Why isn't it in the Constitution? Tell us about judicial review and also why it's so important.
Well, great question. Great observations. The only thing I'd add to your observation is, yeah, they're supposed to be, well, they three branches, and all of them are supposed to check each other. The vision of the Constitution, as Madison put it, but it wasn't just Madison, it was Franklin, it was the rest of Adams. The checks and balances were needed. And yeah, the courts checking that you're referring to, I think Congress could be a more vigorous check, but that's another issue. What you're pulling in is another way. We had categories. And when I thought of your idea of having a podcast and dealing with the question of how the Constitution works and why it doesn't, one was it's in the Constitution, but it's ignored. And that was our example of tariffs or war powers or something like that. But this is sort of a different one. It's not in the Constitution, but it's either presumed to be or it's actually done or it's needed. And the one you're referring to now, I think judicial review, it's not actually in the Constitution, but if you go back, you could see it was an issue raised. In the debates, as Madison, the only record we have of what happened at the Constitutional Convention are Madison's notes and a couple other notes. We have a few other notes, but such as by one of the delegates from Maryland and one of the delegates from New York also kept notes, Yates in New York. But we mostly have Madison's notes, and we know they talked about judicial review because Madison's very interested in it. And some of them said, well, the courts are going to be able to interpret the statutes and declare them whether they're constitutional or not. And other people said, no, we don't want the courts to do that. This is a popular thing. And so they ended up leaving it out. But one of the key ratifiers, and there's people who theorize that what's important is not what the Constitution, what the framers said, but what the ratifiers thought. And John Marshall was one of the key ratifiers in Virginia, and he then became an advocate there and thereafter for judicial review. And when he becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he announces it in Marbury versus Madison decision. And so the idea that the court will get to determine what is or is not constitutional. The Constitution gives us these, to keep on that sports analogy, gives us the rules of the game, and they're the umpires who call them in and out. What John Roberts famously said, the question is he doing it? That's what we'll talk about. Is it working? And so and then the question is, you get President Trump, but other presidents have done this as well. Certainly Andrew Jackson did this. Other ones did as well. And they said, well, the Supreme Court has one interpretation, but I, as president, or us as the Senate, we have an equally authoritative interpretation. And therefore, we can follow our own interpretation. So the question is, and we can look at it, because the Constitution doesn't really say who is the final judge. Is it the president? Is it the Congress? Is it the Supreme Court? Who is the final judge? And President Trump, as like some other presidents, including even much idolized presidents like Lincoln, would say, no, I'm the final judge and I'm not going to follow what this Chief Justice says. There were some examples of that with Lincoln. We can talk about that, of how judicial review works. And since it's not in the Constitution, it would be one of those examples that it's not in the Constitution, but it's done or it's needed. So it raises the question of whether it works. And I don't think we're limited to just judicial review. I think the whole idea of partisan primaries, Constitution doesn't have any idea of partisan primaries, and yet it's those partisan primaries that narrow down who the candidates are. And if the parties both go extreme, you end up with this rather than a collective body, as I think the framers envisioned, where they'd sort of work together without parties into this um, um, hot mess we've got now, where you have two extremists shouting at each other. And maybe that's one of the reasons how the Constitution worked or thought they worked and doesn't. Independent agencies would be another example. The Constitution says nothing about campaign finance reform, says nothing about reproductive rights. Maybe those are things that we need to think about of how the Constitution works or envisioned it. You know, this Constitution was written over 200 years ago. Things have changed since then.
Just a little bit, haven't they? Well, this has been a wonderful first episode and really excited to dive into all of these topics and can't wait to have guests come on and really explore all these various ways that the Constitution works and how it doesn't work, and maybe ways that we can change it so it works better. And Ed, I can't wait to explore all of these things with you in future episodes.
Well, I don't think I could do it with anybody better than you. And I look forward to the guests that you can bring and maybe I can ferret out. And so as we explore this question, because one of the things that doesn't work very well is the amendment process. Even the framers thought we were supposed to be able to amend this thing to keep it up to date. Let's try to think about ways we can make this thing work.
Absolutely. And even Justice Scalia, the ultimate constitutional champion, would admit, and he would say, I concede that the amendment process does not work. So lots of things we can explore there and ways that we can try to help and move things forward. And that's what we're going to do on this show. How the Constitution works and why it doesn't. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. See you soon.